Welcome back to the autonomic nervous system. Last time we learned the exact location of all of the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies. They're all located in the lateral horn of the spinal cord between T1 and L2. Here I've sketched out representative sections of the spinal cord at cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral levels. In red are the cell bodies of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons sitting in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, but only between T1 and L2. There are no preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies in the cervical or sacral levels of the spinal cord. In this video, we want to answer the following question. If the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are only located between T1 and L2, how do they make their way onto spinal nerves that are not at thoracic or lumbar levels? For example, how do sympathetics that are going to travel with cervical nerves make their way to their spinal nerve? To answer this question, we really need just one key principle, which is that although the column of preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies only runs from T1 to L2, the sympathetic chain itself runs the entire vertical length of the spinal cord. So I've drawn in a schematic of the sympathetic chain in black here, and you see that it runs all the way up and down the entire length of the spinal cord. So let's quickly review how a preganglionic sympathetic that's destined for a thoracic spinal nerve makes its way out of the spinal cord. We know that the preganglionic cell body of that sympathetic is going to be in the lateral horn of, let's call this T1. And we know that the preganglionic cell body is going to send an axon out along the ventral root. And just remember, this is not meant to be really an anatomical diagram, just so we're getting the connectivity and the concepts correct here. And so here we have our preganglionic sympathetic axon going out with the ventral root along with the axons of motor neurons. And here we have cell bodies, sensory cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion sending their information back towards the central nervous system, because these are of course afferent or sensory fibers. But remember the course of our typical sympathetic. Goes along through the ventral root, meets up with the spinal nerve, sends a white ramus into the sympathetic ganglion, synapses onto a cell body there, which takes its axon back through a gray ramus back to the spinal nerve and back out to, let's say, a thoracic target. Now, let's say these are preganglionic sympathetics which need to send their axons, synapse, and then join somehow onto a cervical spinal nerve. How is that going to be possible if the preganglionic is sitting at T1? So just like before, we have our ventral root, which is axons of lower motor neurons going out towards the periphery, and then we also have our dorsal root with a dorsal root ganglion, which has sensory cell bodies, and those are going to be conveying information back towards the central nervous system. And once again, the preganglionic sympathetics are going to send their axons out along with the ventral root. It's going to follow its way along the ventral root onto the spinal nerve. Once again, it's going to take a white ramus communicans into the sympathetic chain, and then what it's going to do is it's going to sort of hitchhike up the sympathetic chain to the cervical region and synapse onto a cell body there, a postganglionic cell body, and then take a gray ramus onto a cervical spinal nerve. Of course, there would be cervical spinal nerve here with a dorsal root ganglion, cell bodies, ventral root, spinal nerve passing through the sympathetic chain, and then this gray ramus, this cervical gray ramus, conveying the sympathetics, but now postganglionic sympathetics, back on to the cervical spinal nerve. So let's recap. Let's say this is the entire vertical length of the spinal cord. The preganglionic sympathetics are all going to be located in a column, all in the lateral horn of the spinal cord between T1 and L2. Now, but these preganglionics have to send their fibers to basically join every single spinal nerve in the body, all the way from cervical down to sacral. Well, that's simple enough for them to join the thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves. They go out the ventral root, white ramus, gray ramus, join the spinal nerve at the level. Simple enough. But when they're ultimately going to join a spinal nerve that's above T1 or below L2, they need to use a slightly different path. So let's draw that path now. Preganglionic cell body in the lateral horn somewhere between T1 and L2, joining a ventral root to exit the spinal cord, joining a spinal nerve, exiting the spinal nerve using a white ramus, and then entering the sympathetic chain and ascending above T1, then synapsing and exiting the sympathetic chain, of course, using a gray ramus, which is always going to contain postganglionic axons. So one consequence of this, the idea that there are only preganglionic cell bodies between T1 and L2, whereas the sympathetic chain goes all the way from cervical down to sacral, is that there are only white rami communicons between T1 and L2, because there can only be white rami at levels where there was a preganglionic sympathetic to provide that white ramus. So for example, here's a preganglionic sympathetic taking its way, joining the sympathetic chain using a white ramus. So there will only be white rami between T1 and L2. Then, if I'm ultimately bound for a cervical target, I'm going to get off the spinal nerve on a white ramus, then ascend the sympathetic chain to the level that I ultimately want to join the spinal nerve at, and then exit the sympathetic chain, of course, using a gray ramus after I've synapsed. So there are gray rami at all levels because there are postganglionic axons leaving the sympathetic chain all the way from cervical down to sacral. But there are only white rami, in other words, there are only on-ramps to the sympathetic chain where there are preganglionic cell bodies to supply them. Okay? So hopefully that's clear. So that's it for this video. I've helped you to visualize the locations of the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies which reside between T1 and L2 in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, and also to help you understand how those preganglionics, which are a restricted portion of the spinal cord, send their axons using the sympathetic chain out to join spinal nerves all the way from cervical down to sacral.